Two Dark Lords ruled Middle-earth across two different ages. History remembers them as the same kind of evil, wearing different faces. But sit with their stories closely, and you find something stranger and sadder underneath. They weren't failed in the same way at all. One wanted to unmake everything that wasn't his. The other wanted to keep everything, as long as it belonged to him completely. Tonight we don't ask which one was worse. We ask what made each of them break, and why understanding the difference tells us something true about the shape evil actually takes. Morgoth's story, at its root, is the story of a child who couldn't stand being told no. Before the world itself was fully made, he was already the mightiest of his kind, already gifted beyond almost anyone else in creation. And when he was refused the one thing he wanted most, to shape existence entirely on his own terms, rather than as part of something larger than himself, he didn't grieve that refusal. He decided, in that moment, that if he couldn't have the world his way, he would make sure no one else got to have it any other way either. That's not strategy. That's heartbreak curdled into spite on a cosmic scale. Everything that follows from Morgoth flows from that same wound, over and over, like a bruise that never stops being pressed. He didn't hate the elves, or men, or the world itself for any coherent reason. He hated that they existed at all without his permission. And because that hatred had no real logic to it, his cruelty rarely made strategic sense, even to the people carrying it out on his behalf. He murdered a king in the middle of his own escape, not because it helped him, but because his rage couldn't wait long enough to be useful. He promised loyal allies a homeland and then imprisoned them anyway, not because betrayal served him, but because giving anyone anything good, even people who'd served him faithfully, seemed to offend something broken in him. Every kindness withheld, every promise broken, wasn't calculation. It was simply what pain looks like when it's given enough power to stop pretending to have a reason. There's something almost unbearably sad in that, if you let yourself sit with it instead of just cataloguing the atrocities. Morgoth's entire existence became an elaborate, endless tantrum thrown by a being who once had the chance to help build something extraordinary, and instead spent an age trying to prove that if he couldn't have it, nobody could. He was never really fighting for anything. He was only ever fighting against the fact that the world hadn't bent entirely to his will at the very beginning, and he never found a way to let that go. Sauron's story starts in a completely different key, and that difference matters enormously, because it means his fall is a genuinely different kind of tragedy. Not a tantrum that never ended, but a virtue that curdled slowly into something monstrous. Before he was anyone's nightmare, Sauron loved craft. He loved precision, structure, the deep satisfaction of watching something complicated work exactly as it should. Those aren't villain traits. They're the traits of someone who could have been a builder, a teacher, an artisan whose work outlived him in the best possible way. But somewhere in that love of order, a much smaller, much more dangerous belief took root, that things would only ever truly work if he personally was the one holding all the pieces together, not chaos unleashed out of spite, the way Morgoth understood destruction. Something quieter and, in its own way, more insidious. The conviction that control, applied thoroughly enough, was simply the same thing as care. That's the hinge point worth sitting with, because it's a much more human kind of failure than Morgoth's ever was. Sauron didn't fall because he stopped valuing anything. He fell because the thing he valued most, a world that functioned, that made sense, that didn't waste anything, became impossible for him to separate from needing to be the one in charge of making it happen. Somewhere along the way, wanting things to work well, quietly transformed into believing that only his hand on the wheel could make them work at all. That distinction shapes everything about how each of them actually moved through the world. Morgoth's wars were blunt, furious, often self-defeating, driven by a rage too impatient to plan carefully. He rarely showed his own face on any battlefield, content to let his fury do damage from a great distance while he stayed hidden and safe. Sauron, by contrast, was patient in a way that should unsettle us more than outright fury does. He could wait centuries for an advantage. He could offer generosity, even real generosity, to those he hoped to bring under his control, only turning to destruction once persuasion had genuinely failed. His cruelty had purpose behind it, which somehow makes it feel colder rather than less severe. Where Morgoth simply wanted to hurt what he couldn't own, Sauron wanted to own everything, and was willing to be reasonable, right up until reason no longer served that goal. And yet, watch closely enough, and you'll notice something quietly devastating. Over centuries, Sauron began drifting toward Morgoth's shape anyway. His fear grew, his judgment narrowed. His capacity to see his enemies clearly, rather than as obstacles to be managed, eroded a little more with every age that passed. He never became pure chaos the way his old master had. But the version of him that finally fell at the end of the Third Age was recognizably less himself, more hollowed by suspicion and dread, than the gifted craftsman who first began his long, slow slide by believing that control was simply another word for love. Both of them, in the end, made the same final mistake, even though they arrived at it from opposite directions. Both poured the greater part of themselves into something outside their own bodies, Morgoth into the very substance of the world he tried to ruin, Sauron into a single golden ring meant to hold everything he wanted to control. And both of them were undone, in the end, by that same choice. Morgoth was left diminished and pitiful by the wars he started, a shadow of the terrifying power he once was. Sauron simply ceased. The instant the thing he'd poured himself into was finally destroyed, because he had made himself so entirely dependent on holding on to something that letting go of it meant there was nothing left of him at all. Maybe that's the real difference worth carrying away from their story, more than the maps or the wars or the tally of their crimes. Morgoth's evil was the evil of grief that never learned to end, the refusal to accept a world that wouldn't simply hand him everything he wanted. Sauron's evil was the evil of care turned inward and corrupted, the belief that loving something enough gives you the right to own it completely. One of them wanted to burn the world down because it wouldn't be entirely his. The other wanted to keep the world exactly as it was, as long as every single piece of it answered, in the end, only to him. Neither of them, in the end, got to keep anything at all. If this story moved you, there are more waiting. Quiet corners of Middle-earth that history remembers, but rarely feels. Subscribe and walk them with us.